So hello everyone. This is our CMR, so Center of Migration Research of the University of Warsaw webinar titled Europe and Migration Facing New Political, Social and Economic Challenges. And this is the seminar co-organized, in fact, by two universities. So the University of Warsaw and Warsaw School of Economics. And on behalf of the University of Warsaw, this is the research unit, the Center of Migration Research, composed in this case of two co-organizers, so the Migration Policies Research Unit and the Sociocultural Research Unit. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Paweł Kaczmarczyk, the director of the CMR of the University of Warsaw, just to officially open our meeting. So Paweł, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta, and good morning to everyone, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers. Let me start maybe with an obvious observation. The map of European migration is changing. What's more, it is in the process of constant change since at least mid-1950s. But what is of particular interest for us at the CMR is that since the EU enlargement, a special role in the process is being played by Central and Eastern European countries. First, these were the countries they've been sending massive numbers of migrants in the post-enlargement periods, but more recently, they are being described as the new immigration destinations, with more and more important role on the map of European immigration as well. However, despite all of those developments, two recent crises, so the crisis of 2015 and the recent war in Ukraine, they both, in my opinion, pose extraordinary challenges to the European migration system, to migration policies, but also, I guess, to the very future of Europe and European Union. And this will be the main subject of today's seminar. I'm very much looking forward to be part of it. So without further delay, I will just leave the floor right now to Kamila Kowalska, I guess, yeah, who will just explain how we're going to proceed. So welcome again to everyone, and particularly to our excellent speakers. Yeah, let's start.
Thank you very much. I'm Kamila Kowalska, and I will moderate today's meeting. Let me just explain in a couple of words the agenda. Now we will pass to the main session. We have with us two experts, two professors, two key speakers who will deliver the speeches. And the first one is Professor Karl Kordel, Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Plymouth. And Professor Kordel is as well an editor-in-chief of Ethnopolitics. Professor Kordel will give a speech on migration, European integration, and the idea of nation. And the second key speaker is Professor Jan Zielonka. Professor Jan Zielonka is a professor of European politics at the University of Oxford, and Rolf Darenhof, professor fellow at St. Antony's College, as well as Professor of Politics of International Relations at the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari. Professor Zielonka is author of 18 books, and previously he was also professor of the University of Warsaw, as well as European universities in Florence. The title of the speech of Professor Zielonka is The New Political Geography of Europe. Each speech will take about 20-25 minutes, and then we will have the comment of Dominika Pszczółkowska, PhD in Political Science and Administration of the Center of Migration Research of the University of Warsaw. And following, we will have a Q&A session that will last about 40 minutes. So please, if you have any comments, in the meantime, while we are listening to the speeches, please put your comments, put your questions on the chat, both on the Zoom chat as well as on the live streaming. and so that then we can discuss everything during our Q&A session. We will conclude with the final conclusions of Dr. Sara Bojarczyk, who is head of the Social Cultural Research Unit of the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw. So here is our agenda, and now I would like to welcome again our experts, and I leave the floor to Professor Kartik Bell from the University of Plymouth. Please start. We can start with the first key speaker. Thank you.
Right, can you?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, good. Okay, apologies for the quasi-incoherence of, and I'm not giving any kind of a speech. I'm not Napoleon, among other things. Yeah, I'm not completely with it at the moment because, as I think I said earlier, about 45 minutes back, I got an unexpected tax bill for £3,000. In fact, I may be taking advantage of other countries' asylum laws if I don't get this sorted out soon. Another piece of information for you, which is perhaps of interest to all of you, is that following a couple of by-elections in the United Kingdom last night, the chairman of the Conservative Party resigned with immediate effect. And in his resignation letter, he did not mention the words Boris or Johnson once, which goes completely against all protocol in this kind of situation. So it could be worse. I could be Boris Johnson, who currently is in Rwanda, which is quite prescient, really, given the British government's recently adopted policy of trying to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. There you go. Anyway, migration and the European Union, and indeed its consequences. Well, obviously, I'm speaking as an outsider here. The United Kingdom is not a member of the European Union. It had a tortuous relationship with the European Union whilst it was a member. And take it from me, there is no realistic prospect of the United Kingdom rejoining the European Union in the foreseeable future. Now, in fact, I think the main reason for the no vote in 2016 or whenever it was a reaction to migration. And it was principally, whether we like it or not, a reaction to the mass migration that occurred from 2004 onwards with regard to the ending of restrictions on labour coming in from, shall we say, post-communist Europe. But nevertheless, let's try and stick to the EU as opposed to Britain's tortuous relationship with the EU, although I will mention that as and when necessary. Now, I think it's a truism to say that the European Union was conceived as a peace project back in the 1950s, with its primary objective being to finally end Franco-German rivalries and to, shall we say, establish what Willy Brandt, among others, called eventually a European peace order. Now, although the path to European unification, for want of a better word, has been long and winding, if not long-winded, the Treaty of Rome stated, Treaty of Rome 1957 stated that the goal of the signatories to the Treaty of Rome should be the creation of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, whatever that actually means. But the way in which it's been interpreted in over the years, I think, has been towards increased political cooperation, economic cooperation, enmeshing economies through within one another, the application of the subsidiarity principle, and the pooling of sovereignty. Yeah. Now, this in turn raises, I think, what is a kind of existential question, because it raises, unspoken questions about the future character of the nation state and where sovereignty actually arises. And it also, given that it poses questions about the future of the nation state, it asks us, as it were, as citizens, to ask ourselves, what kind of nation state do we want? What kind of nation state do we prefer? What kind of nation state is actually viable? And that in turn, I think, calls into question the foundations upon which many, if not most, in fact, if not all European nation states, rhetorically or otherwise, are based. Now, notionally, sovereignty lies with the people, or in the United Kingdom's case, more obliquely with Parliament in the name of the people. But whether it is the people, or whether it is Parliament, or whether it is the manifestation of organized political cleavages through political parties and so forth, when it comes to the EU and the relationship of individual countries with the European Union, the question is about sovereignty and where sovereignty lies. And although, as we all know, this was a particularly vexed question when it came to the United Kingdom, dating all the way back to, well, you know, all the way back to before I was born, basically, which is a long time ago. We saw these tensions arising within the European Union and its various antecedents, the EEC, the EC, all the way back certainly to the early 1960s. If you look at the relationship between the administrations of General de Gaulle and what you might loosely call Brussels, the empty chair policy, the rows about common agricultural policy, so on and so forth. And indeed, de Gaulle's vision of Europe, which was completely at odds with that of the Treaty of Rome and those of his contemporary in Germany, the West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, and of the wider CDU-CSU, in fact, the German political class, basically. So it's not a peculiarly British problem, it's not a peculiarly French problem, but it is a problem that has dogged the European Union ever since its inception. Sovereignty. Where does sovereignty lie? Who has responsibility for policy making? Who is the final arbiter? Is it Brussels? Is it the nation state? Is it Brussels with the consent and the assent of individual governments? And again, where does that actually leave this amorphous mass we call the people? Huh? How do they express themselves? And of course, we saw these tensions over sovereignty coming to a head a few years ago with the decision by David Cameron, which was allegedly taken in the waiting room of Manchester Airport to go for this referendum on the future of the European Union and its relationship with the United Kingdom in 2014, culminates in the vote for Brexit in 2016. But this vote itself is taking place alongside a, shall we say, a further questioning of the relationship between the European Union and its member states, and the question of where sovereignty lies, that occurs in particular with the contemporary regimes in both Hungary and Poland, which until fairly recently were very closely allied with one another. But as we all know, the Polish government and the Hungarian government have somewhat divergent views on how to deal with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or special military operation if you come from Mars, or indeed planet Putin. So again, we have further examples. With accession, we have examples of countries, you know, for example, Poland and Hungary, whose idea of where sovereignty should lie and whose idea of how much cooperation is useful, how much cooperation is necessary, and how much cooperation should be only okayed with the approval of national governments. We have this tension running all the way through an increasingly diverse and possibly incoherent, if not incoherent, set of institutions. And I'm beginning to sound a bit like Boris Johnson here, but there you go. Now, so ultimately, when it comes to sovereignty, what kind of Europe, what kind of nation state? And within that is a second question, which is related to the question of migration. Should the nation state be conceived primarily of what we might call an ethnically based society, a society in which there is a, shall we say, a clearly, I don't want to use the word dominant because that would be wrong, where there is a clearly established community which has, according to all the usual criteria, a common history, a common sense of values, a common language, a common culture, a common mythology, a common shared territory? Or should this nation state be based upon a series of values to which all its citizens, regardless of their origins, can hold in common? Now, I don't want to get involved in this stage in arguments about the extent to which civic nation states in particular have ever actually existed. But nevertheless, at a rhetorical level, they exist. And with the reality of mass migration, the idea that a nation state, particularly a nation state that has signed up to a supranational agenda and has agreed, no matter how grudgingly, to pooling and sharing sovereignty with other nation states or other member states and with a series of supranational institutions, to what extent is it actually viable to continue believing that nation states can be self-contained units? Now, we saw this debate, I think, coming into relief most sharply first of all, after 2004, where the British government took a rather, to be quite blunt about it, incautious approach, whereas other governments took a more measured approach. But also, of course, not only did we have this large wave of migration from east to west, with the onsets of the Syrian civil war, which has to be located within a much kind of broader set of conflicts and a much deeper seated crisis in parts of what used to be called the less developed world. Like North Africa, Central Africa, the Middle East. Some countries which were completely unused to the phenomenon of mass migration on the part of the other began to witness the possibility of this migration occurring. Now, we all know that different national governments asserted sovereignty in different ways, and some governments were more open to receiving migrants than were others. But no matter how the individual governments responded, two questions were at the core of all of this. Where does sovereignty lie? And what is the nature of the nation which the government purports to represent? In theory, for governments such as the United Kingdom, or indeed perhaps France, which is rhetorically, and I think rhetorically more than reality, been built upon the notion of a civic community, and where there is a history of mass migration. In the United Kingdom's case, it starts with the Irish in the 19th century. You have, well, in fact, it predates that, the mass migration of the Huguenots in the 17th century. But particularly the mass migration of the Irish in the 19th century to mainland Britain. In the aftermath of the Second World War, we have a smaller migration of Poles. After actually at the turn of the 20th century, we have Jewish migration from the former Soviet Empire. But most particularly, we have the migration of non-white people, which begins conventionally in 1947, 1948, with the arrival of a ship called the Windrush. But Britain, like France, like Belgium, being a former colonial power, for a variety of reasons, opens its door to certain former colonial subjects as citizens from the 1940s onwards. And despite the fact that this mass migration causes tensions between between incomers and the host communities, for example, there was a mass pogrom of Algerians in Paris in, I think it was 1960, and there were race riots in Britain in the late 1950s. Nevertheless, the nation and the nation state have been redefined in countries such as France, Belgium, Britain. The Netherlands is also another good example, to the extent where it is explicitly acknowledged that people of a migration background are citizens with exactly the same rights, and indeed, in a sense, exactly the same identity as are those people who claim citizenship by virtue of descent from, from the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons, the Romans, the Normans, you name it, it was there, yeah? So the indigenous population and the migrant population are not distinguished from one another in any formal sense at all, even to the extent that there is no framework legislation for national minorities in the United Kingdom, unlike in most other countries. France provides us with another exception. Now, governments such as the Orban regime in Hungary, the Law and Justice regime in Poland, and the various other regimes in the region, clearly, when it comes to questions of migration, cling to the idea that a nation is a community of common descent as opposed to being a community of common values. And they rail against globalists, multiculturalists, and the amorphous thing known as the Brussels bureaucracy. Whilst at the same time, of course, not exactly biting the hand that feeds them, because they all know where the money is. But nevertheless, it does raise a question. It raises a question. And the question, I think, is being posed particularly sharp, in a particularly sharp manner at the moment in Poland and elsewhere in Europe, but particularly in those states that have a border with Ukraine. The mass migration of Ukrainians is a fact. Now, regardless of how this war pans out, it is foolish to assume that those migrants from Ukraine who have fled war to third countries will all go home. They won't. They will put down roots. They will stay in the countries that have granted asylum. Some will go back, but how many go back depends on the outcome of the war. And therefore, countries in the European Union and indeed the United Kingdom have a question to ask. And the question to ask is, again, how do we assimilate? How do we integrate, as opposed to integrate's a much better word. How do we integrate this new group of migrants within our society? And it throws into ever sharper relief that in an age where borders are much more permeable than they once were, where travel is, at least in theory, simpler than it once was, where there are huge networks of both legal and non-legal migration, is it actually sensible? Is it actually possible to carry on in the belief, or with the belief, that sovereignty ultimately lies with the nation state and the nation state only, and that the nation that the state purports to protect and represent is made up of, shall we say, an ethnically cohesive community. So in order to conclude, what do you do? I mean, I've posed, I wouldn't say a series of questions, I've made a series of comments as much as anything else. What do you actually do? Well, there are no easy answers. It's as simple as that. There aren't any. Now, having said that, I think we have to acknowledge, as I've just said, mass migration is here to stay. Yeah, people such as Nigel Farage, Viktor Orban may not like that fact. They may resent that fact. But there are various ways I could express this. So I'll express it in a polite manner. They don't stand a chance. It's here to stay. The ethnically constructed nation state, which arose in Europe in the 19th century, is, barring some kind of unforeseen geopolitical disaster, effectively history. The question remains then, for those states that are members of the European Union, how they deal with that question, how they come to terms with that question, and how they can devise strategies which, shall we say, integrate people regardless of their ethnic origin, their religious disposition, if they actually have one, or indeed their sexual orientation. And on that note, I will close because I think I've said quite enough.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Cordell.
Camilla, I can hardly hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Yeah, okay,
yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you very much for your considerations, for your comments, for your for the speech. And I would like to encourage again everybody to leave your comments, to leave your questions on the chat, so that we can collect everything and then discuss everything during our Q&A session. So please write it down, and then we will pass to the replies later on when we finish our main part of this seminar. I would like to invite now Professor Jan Zielonka to give your speech, to contribute. The floor is yours.
Yes, good morning to everybody. I'm very pleased to be with you today. I have to sit in such a way that you don't get a sound from the Venetian rather strong sunny day. I will continue the major theme of Karl, which is the nation state and its states of sovereignty, let's put it this way. But I will concentrate not so much on the British war on the European Union, but on the Russian war on Ukraine and how it affects political geography in Europe, and also migration, although I have to admit that I feel rather shy to talk about migration among real specialists on migration on this other side of the Zoom lines. So I'm simply trying to be modest and understand what I know, what I don't know. But let's start with the Russian invasion, because it somehow suggests that the history goes in circles. We seem to be back where we were before the fall of the Berlin Wall. but the wall dividing the word of democracy and peace from the word of autocracy and war. These are the words of Biden, more or less, pronounced in Poland. This wall is now not in Berlin, but on Poland's eastern border. And we, in fact, you know, when I listen to speeches and commentaries, I have a feeling that we are back with the rhetoric of Cold War, where the language of arms race, sanctions is back. Certainly, we no longer talk about Immanuel Kant's community of European values, unless there is an event like yesterday with accessions with Moldova and Ukraine getting candidate status to the European Union, but we basically concentrate on other agenda than community of values. Nor we are talking very much about Hugo de Groot's international law binding the nations, because this international law is being now in tatters, basically. And I say it with great regret, because I used to work at Leiden University, the place where Hugo de Groot was associated with. And in fact, my office was on the street, which was called Hugo de Groot. So there is a problem here for people like myself. And we basically revived Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan with its emphasis on strong state, conflict, and military might, so to speak. But make no mistake, this war has not generated the political unity, let alone normative unity, as it is often claimed. If I compare public discourse in Italy and Poland, I have a feeling that those two countries belong to different planets, even though official policy of Draghi and Morawiecki vis-à-vis Ukraine are more or less the same, but the public discourse is totally different. In Italy, they constantly talk about peace and miss opportunities for peace, while in Poland, we talk largely about the conduct of war. And when I follow Poland's public TV, I also have a feeling that we are at war not with Russia, but with France and Germany, but this is another problem. My problem with the current rhetoric is that it's not so much political, but conceptual. I have conceptual problem, not political. In political terms, I believe war and peace are two sides of the same coin, and the conflict between the advocates of war and the advocates of peace is more apparent and real, in my view. Peace, not war, is the ultimate objective, although sometimes you cannot achieve peace without war. And this is the case at present. Ukraine was invaded, and it should be defended if we are not to embrace the law of the jungle. But my conceptual problems come closer to what Carl was talking about, although from a different angle. My conceptual problem is with the current discourse that is overly state-centric, and it fails to grasp the world beyond states. In fact, we seem to argue that state is back in this world of Leviathan. The reason why I'm skeptical about this discourse is that states are clearly failing to perform their self-proclaimed objectives or functions. Think about protections of borders. Think about securing peace, generating welfare, legitimizing decisions. In essence, the new geography is not about the north-side divide in Europe, Poles versus Italians, It is about the movement from Europe of states to Europe of networks, with implications on many things which are interesting for migration specialists, but indirectly, not directly. Let's start with the alleged renaissance of states. States are supposed to offer personal security to citizens, and yet the pandemic has killed millions and ruined the lives of many more supposedly fortunate citizens. And despite terrific scientific advances and the heroic efforts of the medical personnel. So if we succeeded to save other millions, it's largely to scientific community and the medical community, including those notoriously ignored and undermined by states like nurses, if not first of all them. States are supposed to provide the military security, and yet despots such as Putin have not been deterred from invading other states, killing innocent people and threatening a nuclear annihilation. Environmental degradation is progressing, notwithstanding regular climate change summits. Inequalities have reached unprecedented levels, regardless of repeated pledges to reduce them. Capitalism moves from one crisis to another at the expense of ordinary families. I mean, now we will face in Europe inflation crisis, if not stagflation crisis, after, as you know, devastating financial crisis. We are now faced with cybersecurity threats on top of the better known threats posed by nukes, tanks, machine guns, in the hands not only of predatory states, but fanatic individuals. And you can tell me, oh, you are demagogical, but none of this is fake news. This is all what is going on. I'm talking about ABC of political history of the recent 2 or 3 decades. And if states are the strongest political actors, the question is, why are they so inept? We may well admit that states are not as strong as, sometimes you can say, okay, we agree, states cannot handle those issues, but we say, yes, democracy only exists in nation states at present. So if we don't have states, we don't have democracy. So let's consider how democratic our states are at present. And so you don't think that I'm demagogical. I will not ask my Polish friends how democratic is their state at present. But I will cite the Eurobarometer. EU boring, statistical data showing that more than 60% of Europeans declare that they tend not to trust the national government and parliament. More than 60% of Europeans do not trust the democratic elected government and parliament. And ask how they would feel about reducing the number of national parliamentarians in the country and giving those seats to artificial intelligence with access to their data. No less than half of respondents, particularly young, prove enthusiastic. So we've got a problem. We've got a problem, but as always, there's no simple explanation. But I will point to the most important explanation, which I called unbounding. What is unbounding? Unbounding is a process during which the existing boundaries either wither, move, or change in nature. And over the past 3 decades, we had 3 really profound and bounding revolutions. Geopolitical, caused by the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it was not only about alliance enlarging, organization like EU, all ideology, ideas, even fashion traveled since with few limitations. Then we of course had economic unbounding. You know what I have in mind. It's globalization, but in European context, it's particular single market, which is Europeanization. And the least appreciated by political scientists is the digital revolution, which implied, the rise of internet transactions and communication. And this revolution started more or less at the same time as, the geopolitical revolution, which is, in the early 90s, late 80s. And who are the key losers of those 3 unbounding revolutions? The key losers are states, hierarchical and heavy institutional states. And who are the key beneficiaries? Informal networks. Because networks are now able to utilize their traditional assets, things like speed, flexibility, inclusiveness, adaptability, without actually sacrificing command, control, and coordination. And the result is, to use Spanish-American sociology professor words, Castells, an unprecedented combinations of flexibility and task performance, of coordinated decision-making, and horizontal communications, which provide a superior form of human action, unquote. And you can tell to me, okay, the power of networks is most pronounced in the field of economics and communication. But I can tell you, it is also increasingly pronounced in the field of security. Think about Anonymous, the hacker collective that has declared civil war in Russia. They enter secret meetings of the Kremlin. Or think about the role of Elon Musk tackling satellite internet service in Ukraine, or the role of the Telegram, the internet, Russian internet provided with, with engines outside, where all Russians moved after Western networks have been blocked by the Kremlin. And I'm not even talking about the role of financial networks in preventing Russian banks to finance the war. So what I try to say is the internet-based security and economics enables bottom-up dynamism, blurs organizational boundaries, and rebalances power relationships. States are still the main actors, no doubt about it, still the main actors conducting military operations. But to be successful, states must follow the logic of networks and enter the fray. And I'm not a technological optimist, but students of international relations cannot ignore the role of digital technology in conducting military, let alone financial operations. Where migration comes here. I have little time left, so let me be brief on that. And I'm not going to talk about how, for instance, migrants utilize digital technology. You know these problems much better than me. Let me only say that abounding, which is about borders, is here very important. because borders are the main pillars of any state organization, and states with porous borders cannot claim to be sovereign. In fact, migration clearly shows that sovereignty is an organized hypocrisy, to use famous American professor words, Krasner, Stephen Krasner. You probably read his book under this title, Sovereignty, Organized Hypocrisy. Migration intensifies because states fail to secure peace, mismanage development aid, and ignore climate change. Despite all the rhetoric, open borders have little to do with migration. Borders in Europe were never opened as sovereignties claimed. They were open with the breakdown of this war, but not earlier. They were open in 2015, but only after the German government realized that it cannot do what the Hungarian government was prepared to do, is basically to behave like the Nazi towards these thousands of people trying to enter the continent. Borders in Europe were never open. We had successive migratory crises because we adopted misguided migratory policies. These policies were not only unethical, they were ineffective, if not stupid altogether. What have we done over the last 3 decades? For instance, since we had Albanians entering Italian shores, because our previous so-called migration crisis was with the Balkan War and the fall of Yugoslavia. Time and again, we paid off autocrats in the hope that they will keep migrants away from us. Surprise, surprise, this never worked for a long time. I still have fresh pictures of Silvio Berlusconi kissing Colonel Gaddafi. We know how it ended. Time and again, we generated instability and poverty in neighboring states, and we blame traffickers for migration. This is what we still do, I'm afraid. We paid I don't know how much to a Turkish dictator to keep migrants outside our borders. Do you believe it will solve anything? I wouldn't be surprised if we will soon start paying the same money to another dictator, Lukashenko. The current exodus of Ukrainians is obviously caused by the Russian aggression. But why we allowed Putin to bully Ukraine and us for so many years? After the illegal annexations of Crimea, Italy has increased imports of Russian oil and gas by 30%. What has Poland done to move from carbon dioxide to green energy? Why don't you ask your government in Poland what they have done to move to green energy? And, because diversifications of oil and gas imports is only part of the story. My solutions to all these problems is not to embrace international governance controlled by states only. I believe that we ought to allow other actors to sit at the decision-making table, public and private, local and transnational. I have in mind primarily cities and NGOs, including business associations. I have no time to go into details, but states-controlled international organizations like the United Nations and sadly also the European Union are not doing very well. In essence, we ought to move from transnational governance to a network governance in Europe and beyond. And you will have to figure out what does it mean for migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zielonka. We pass now to comments of Dominika Pszczółkowska. I leave the floor to you, Dominika.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you both professors for very interesting talks. I have to say, even maybe moving talks for me, because I believe the moment when we are talking is quite special, and you know, what we are saying is very important. I think it's at least from a Polish perspective, a decisive moment. I would say, such as '89. Such as joining the European Union, and now would be the third such moment in recent Polish history for me, because lots can change, and also in our own thinking and our own vision of ourselves right now. So I have some comments on what you said, and some rather practical questions that I would like you to address. The comments. First of all, on sovereignty. Of course, it's a very important issue that you raised, Professor Cordell, although I have to say that from the point of view of today and from where we're sitting, the rather simple question of sovereignty from an outside power imposing its will is the basic question. So you know, this is what we're thinking about right now, and the question of how we divide our sovereignty between the state and the European Union is a bit of a luxury issue for the moment. You know, first make sure you have that sovereignty. You seem to be saying that Poland and Hungary are different from Western Europe in, I would say, three basic things. One is the different vision of sovereignty again. I have to say, probably if Marine Le Pen was president of France right now, that wouldn't look so different to what Law and Justice in Poland are saying, and what Mr. Orban is saying. So the division lines are, I would say, not as clear as you would maybe have them, and especially given that the views of the nations are not in line with the views of the people in power, at least in Poland. If you look at the Eurobarometer poll, the polls even before this war were the most pro-European, period. And a majority wanted more European integration. Well, this is obviously not what you hear from the Law and Justice government, but you know, if and hopefully the people in power in Poland change, then the message it would be projecting on these issues would be very different, and perhaps more in line with what the Polish people think. The second question, which you suggest that we view differently than France, the UK, and some other Western European countries, is the vision of the state and what it is based on. That's true, although I have to say, again, Law and Justice did not win the elections based on their anti-immigration rhetoric and the rhetoric of you know, Polish versus the other. Certainly not. They won the election on inequalities, and the other things were just additions. And you see, again, in Polish public opinion that, for example, Polish people were very pro-refugee before 2015. In opinion polls, about 70% would say that we should accept refugees. Then after the vicious campaign from Law and Justice, 70% said we shouldn't. So obviously this was not something that changed based on their personal experience. They didn't have any, refugees in 2015 were not arriving in large numbers in Poland. It was based on political rhetoric and the rhetoric of the media that were repeating what Law and Justice said. And right now, there is a very interesting thing going on, and this is why I say that it's a decisive moment. That is, there is a debate starting now about a binational Polish state. Many commentators, many people are saying, yes, of course, Ukrainians are here to stay, and we have to redefine ourselves as not a Polish state for Polish people, but the two nations living together within one state. And so far, so good. I don't see any huge opposition to that kind of rhetoric. Of course, if these were not Ukrainians, if they were Muslim people, for example, I think the situation would be very different. But anyway, we're in a very decisive point, I think, also based on how we see ourselves and how we see the Polish state. So those are my comments. I have 3 questions, and they're rather practical, but they're linked to what you said. First question for both professors. Of course, we are at a moment when Ukraine and Moldova have become candidates for the European Union. Do you think the European Union means it? That is, does Germany, France, other Western European states, because I have no doubt that in Poland, everybody means and would be happy to accept Ukraine. But in Western Europe, is it a case of giving these countries something to aspire to and to reform based on those aspirations? Or is it a case of really admitting the possibility of them joining the European Union? That's my first question. My second related question, if they were to join, how would the architecture of the European Union have to change? Where would the sovereignty have to lie? How could the EU function? Because I cannot really imagine it functioning as it is now, for example, with the voting system. And in very practical terms, the possibility of Germany and France being outvoted by a bunch of Central Europeans on many issues. So how would the European Union architecture have to change? And the third question, perhaps I'm an unreformed optimist, but is unbounding happening now on EU borders? Obviously, the border with Ukraine has become porous is maybe not the right word, but many more people coming through, many more contacts, also virtual contacts. A lot is changing. So is it a case of unbounding, and what would it entail in practical terms? I mean, right now, Ukrainian people have the right to work in the European Union for 18 months, perhaps this can be extended. Are we learning anything from this? Would the lesson be that we should let refugees, irrespective of where they're coming from, take up employment in the European Union? Because it seems that with Ukrainian people, this is working out quite well. Okay, I will stop here. Lots of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominika, for your comments. And so basically, we started our Q&A session in a natural way. I will leave the floor now to both the professors to answer the comments and first of all the questions of Dominika, and then we will we're starting to have questions on the chat. So please take this time to think of your questions, the formal questions. We will answer all the questions. But now I leave the floor to the professors and so as to answer the questions of Dominika. Thank you.
Would you like to go first, Jan?
Sure. So I probably answered the last questions about unbounding and Ukraine borders. Look, I'm not saying that there are no borders. I'm saying that the borders are much more fuzzy that we assume. And we have very diversified reality when it comes to borders, which are at odds with the Westphalian paradigm. There is a state which controls borders, you know, and everybody who is allowed only can cross these borders on selective manner. You know, Poland is a very good example. It has sealed its border with Belarus, even though I read press report that you know that a lot of trade, suspicious trade, suspicion in the sense that breaking the sanctions is going through this border, but it is certainly sealed for the movement of refugees. We have a semi-open border to Ukraine. It depends on the flows of migrants, you know, and when there is no much flow, they are able to somehow at least stamp somebody, you know, to have some bureaucratic accounting. But if the flow is greater, it becomes fiction. And we have a kind of a very peculiar kind of border with the rest of Europe, where there is a Schengen, but successive, you know, repeatedly suspended for this or that. It's all the time changing. It's changing. No, for different reasons. Pandemic was one of the reasons. You remember when the pandemic broke out, they immediately sealed national borders. Even though the borders which really counted were borders around the centers of infections. So in Italy, we had a big fight between North Lombardia, you know, rich people from Milan coming to these summer houses in Campania, and in fact, you know, where infections were much lower, and people were saying, why those Milanese are free to travel to Campania, but you cannot go to France, right? Why I'm saying of those things, that all of those borders are obviously much fuzzier than the official rhetoric. And I'm not going to speak on the UK in the presence of Carr. Carr can say those things himself, but control of migration was promised by successive government in Britain, and we know how it ended. And when Salvini came to power in Italy and became interior minister, he also declared, you know, to end something is called illegal migration, but he actually was not able de facto to do anything by some public relations scandals of pestering NGOs on the sea with migrants, right? For which, by the way, he may still be put accountable in courts. Because there is a very strong argument that what he did was abuse of power. I'm saying those things is that the idea of closed and open borders is for the birds. It never works like this. And with migrations, which is as old as humanity, there are various ways of handling migrations. And it's always the questions of methods, degree, and basically paradigms you have. And as it happened, our paradigm in Europe is that internal borders are being abolished, external borders are being reinforced. And we basically try to seal the external borders with rather, and to pay off these, Libyan warlords or Turkish leaders, which these policies work for some time, and then before they break. We paid off how many Arab leaders, dictators, we paid money to keep those migrants offshore, basically keeping them in power and not allowing any democratic breakthrough. And then came the Arab Spring, and with, of course, also implications for migrations, something where they try to prevent. I'm not going to go to details. You know those stories much better, but I just want, and I'm talking more about southern border than eastern border, which you also know better. But what I try to say here, that this whole notion that the choices between open and closed border is just totally fictitious. And so you have to understand that you have to adopt, and if you want to have proper border policy, you first you have to make sure that the external environment is not impoverished, either by economic catastrophe or ecological one, that there is no war, and that you don't create, even contribute to wars which generate movements of people, and that you basically have a state which can do something more than PR, yeah, something more than PR, because so most of those states I'm talking about, and we are talking about the most developed countries in the world, members of the European Union, most of those governments are basically running by decree, increasing in emergency mode for at least 10 to 15 years, since financial crisis, through pandemic crisis, now this war. Most of those governments are running basically by decree in emergency mode. My colleague from LSE called it WhatsApp politics. Most of the decisions are being communicated and done by WhatsApp these days, with no oversight, with no reflection, deliberation. There's evidence for this, and the results are as they are. I mean, most of those problems we had have not been solved, although we invested a lot of money we don't have. And if you believe that we solve, banking problems and the Greeks are going to pay their debts, good for you. If you believe that we solve migration problem because we paid off a lot of money to Turkey, good for you. But if you don't believe those things, yeah, or if you believe that we just can impose symbolic sanctions on Putin and let Ukrainians basically die out and sign another imposed deal, good for you. But if you don't believe that this will work, you have to change a paradigm, because it cannot go like this forever. And the issue of borders is the most fundamental issue to be sorted out, particularly in the context of those unbounding which I mentioned. And there is a lot of political hot air about rebounding, in Britain in particular, but Carl tried to tell you how, that it's not just hot air, it is something what Italians call aria fritta, which is fried air, Carl? And despite heroic trip of Prime Minister Johnson to Rwanda now, good luck to him.
Boris, my hero, not. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, how do I follow that? Well, I'm actually going to just echo it, really. With regard to this notion of unbounding borders. But just to reiterate, until you actually deal with the causes of mass migration, there is absolutely nothing that can be done about it. Like Professor Zielonka said, you can pay off all the dodgy dictators in the world. You can put up metaphorical fences. You can put up physical fences. You can put gunboats in the Channel, in the Mediterranean. You are not going to stop it. End of the story. It's a fact. It's unstoppable. It's like no tsunami you could ever possibly imagine. And this reinforces my overall point. The nation state, as was conceived in the 19th century, is finished. That's it. You may have some kind of states have existed since, I don't know, Babylonian times. But the state that was devised in, around, during, and in the wake of the French Revolution is finished. Yeah. And one of the things that's putting an end to it is mass migration. Now, before I deal with the EU, as it were, with regard to comments, which I found really, really interesting, excellent point about Le Pen. I think what it actually illustrates is a really worrying trend that those people who've got their heads firmly in the sand, and there are many millions of them, will continue to vote for authoritarian candidates at political elections. Simple as that. Yeah, regardless of whether they live in Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe. This thing we loosely call populism, particularly populism of the right, is a re-emergent trend. Why it's not called fascism is quite beyond me, but there you go. Again, you know, extremely interesting points about Poland, which I'll investigate in more depth next month when I return to Poland. That is. Yeah, of course, Law and Justice, part of its success is on the fact that it puts money in people's pockets, has created this, you know, rather elaborate welfare state. But you know, nevertheless, when people say they want Europe more into European integration, yeah, I hope some people actually mean that. But on the other hand, if people want more into European integration as a means of bypassing a domestic government they don't like, well, you know, Britain shows the, shall we say, the pitfalls that you may enter into. Now, with regard to the reconstruction of European architecture, look, I'm sorry, but I'm going to dive out of this one for a number of reasons. One, because you know, in my exalted position as emeritus professor, I no longer take as close an interest in the finer detail of these things as I once did. What I would say, though, and I'm sorry if this is going to sound bleak, you know, with regard to Moldovan Ukrainian prospects, there are two ways of answering this and how it will affect the European Union. One is, as we've just been told, you know, policy is made increasingly by WhatsApp, on the hoof, people just thinking, yes, something must be done. And in the event that Moldova and Ukraine eventually become members of the European Union, the architecture will be amended to take that into account. How they're going to amend the architecture, no one knows. As my father used to say, all speculation is useless. What I would also say, though, so this offer's been made to Moldova and Ukraine. One country, Ukraine, is in imminent danger of being wiped from the map. And in all probability, if Putin succeeds in his medium-term goal, I wouldn't even call it a maximum goal, his medium-term goal of wiping Ukraine from the map, Moldova will follow. And so the question then becomes, shall we say, and this is not you know, any kind of comment on yourself, it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, but the question could, as a result of warfare, become, you know, just academic in the worst sense of the word. Yeah, I'm sorry, but you know, that's my rather bleak assessment of Moldovan and Ukrainian prospects of joining the European Union, and how the European Union would accommodate to countries that are markedly poorer than existing member states. That's it. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's follow with, let's continue with the questions. We have a couple of questions that showed up on the chat. Let's start with the first question that arrived, and it's to both the speakers. Should we start to think that the nation states do not suit current reality, and because of that, many conflicts arise?
Sorry, can you say that again, please, Camilla?
Yes. Should we start to think that nation states do not suit current reality, and because of them, many conflicts arise?
Yeah, personally speaking, I think it's more a question. The causes of conflict are, as both of us have said, both myself and Professor Shalonka, lie in like structural inequalities within society, within phenomena such as climate change, and the unequal distribution of wealth and resources. Nation states as such, as a political entity, their job, as it were, is to try and moderate such conflicts, deal with such conflicts. And that's all I can sort of say at the moment. That's some kind of elaboration on exactly what the question is getting at. But,
Professor Zielonka, would you like to add something?
Oh, no, I agree with this. Look, this probably will come with further questions about nation state, and so I fully agree with the statement the 19th century concept doesn't work in the 21st century. There is no doubt about this. But I also believe that as long as you don't have plausible alternatives, states will hang around. The rise of sovereignist parties is a very good example for this. Do they provide solutions to problems? Well, I don't think so. But states have a long history, and they are kind of on our mental maps, and if you say something, Europe of states, people know what it is. But when I say Europe of networks, people get nervous. They ask me, what is it all? And I have to show them many maps, to show that the map of states is only one of many and not necessarily the most crucial in what is going on in Europe. But if you turn on television, and not only public television in Poland, but also television in other countries, this is all about France, against Germany, Russia, Poland, Britain, because this is how it is. If you believe in reform rather than revolutions or just a catastrophe, then you try to reform those things. My way is to basically abolish the monopoly on decision making and resources. But there might be other ways to do this. And even if you agree with me, there are various institutional solutions to do this. They may work or may not work. But I think continuing the way we are at present is doomed to fail, and it's going to produce a lot of hardship in democratic world. In the I don't believe that autocratic China will run the 21st century necessarily. I'm not expert on China, but been to China many times and talked to various people there. And I have a feeling that even Chinese propagandists are not sure how they generated the success, which is obvious, in China. But they also point out many unresolved problems, and it's enough to go to Beijing during smog and you understand what I have in mind. But having said that, my major preoccupation is not the contest of superpowers. My major preoccupation is how we make our governance democratic and effective. This is for me the most important. And if the state is not doing well on both grants, we have something to change, but this is probably for another conference.
Okay.
Can I interject there? I mean, I think what's just been pointed out there is really important, that there is a kind of legitimacy deficit that is apparent in throughout the whole of Europe, actually. Yeah, a disjuncture between the political elites and the mass of society that they purport to represent. Yeah, so that's just an observation.
Thank you. I leave the floor now to Professor Kaczmarczyk, Director of Center of Migration Research of the University of Warsaw. Yes, please go ahead with your questions.
Thank you, Camila, and thank to both speakers for your contributions and your introductions to the discussion. In fact, I have two questions, and they have been just direct reaction to what just said, but obviously just feel free to respond, both of you. And maybe the first question for Frank Cordell mainly, because at some point you mentioned the Brexit case and the role of post-2004 migration in the process. And for me, this is a fascinating story because as researchers, we know a lot about the post-migration flows to United Kingdom. And we know very well both advantages and costs of the process. And still, it's quite controversial what was, in fact, the role of the migration and perception of migration and attitudes towards migrants in the vote to leave, the referendum and the process. So my question would be, what is your reading of this process, the relationship, and maybe what kind of lessons are to be drawn from this particular story? And the second question for Jan Zielonka, because you've spoken about the process of unbounding and the growing role of networks, and this is really a fascinating issue. But now the question is, and I guess I also saw this kind of question on the chat, what will be and what could be the future of migration policies or migration governance, or if you would like to call it, maybe people call it. Because, you know, as for now, migration policies, they are largely under domain of nation states still. And the background of my question is quite recent. And this is the recent flows from Ukraine to Poland, because as for me, this is a really fascinating case and quite directly linked to what you just said. Because as we all know, the major role in the process was played by networks, as you said, civil society. This is my opinion. In my opinion, Polish government played only a minor role. Of course, they decided to open the border. They introduced some regulations, but in general, the role was rather modest. So the question would be, because you somehow focus on border control, but we have many more domains of migration policies. So the question is, how would you see the role of networks or civil society of the process of creation and implementation of migration policies?
So who should start?
Oh, okay, I'll go first. Brexit. Oh no. Yeah, well, I brought the subject up, so I'm hoisted on my own petard. Yeah, right. Okay, I suppose the extent to which each particular issue was a factor in people's decision to vote for Brexit or not is kind of really difficult to disentangle. You know, some people argue that as much as anything else, well, they voted for Brexit in order to send a message to the establishment or to the government or to the politicians in general or the elites or the bosses. Again, illustrating this point just made about legitimacy deficit. We're voting for Brexit because you, the elite, are in favour of the European Union. Oh, okay, then fine. But no matter how you cut it, migration did play a role. It's played a role in British politics since even before I was born. Certainly played a role in my own conception, given my parents aren't from Britain or weren't from Britain. How can you put it? by the early 2000s, and especially by post 2004, what was remarkable was the extent to which the wave of migration occurred. Now, I'm old enough to remember not so much the wave of West Indian migration, but I am old enough to remember the wave of migration that occurred from the Indian subcontinent, which was a bit later than that from the West Indies. What was absolutely apparent was the demographic change that was occurring in the United Kingdom, particularly in areas where there had previously been little or no migration. And it was in precisely in those areas, so I'm talking about small towns, medium-sized towns, particularly those concentrated away from major conurbations, where people were faced for the first time ever with mass migration, that the vote in favor of Brexit was highest. Now, the extent to which that was a xenophobic vote or a racist vote, or just, again, a vote because people felt unsettled by the obvious change that was occurring. Again, you know, we could debate this forever, and it's not really kind of within the remit of this particular debate, I think. But what was also interesting was, and this is, you know, somewhat impressionistic, but don't be fooled into thinking that the people who were most in favor of Brexit were white people who could trace their ancestry back to 1066 or some kind of quasi-mythical date in the past. But many what you might call first, second, or third generation Britons, in other words, people of an Afro-Caribbean and a particularly South Asian background, were also in favor of Brexit. South Asians markedly so. Partly because it appears that there was a belief among many South Asians that, to be quite blunt about it, fewer migrants from or visas for migrants from Eastern Europe means more visas for South Asians. And also there was a kind of feeling among the what you might call the South Asian business community that Britain, free of the bonds of the European Union, would become even more global than it is now. That slogan, Global Britain. Yeah, so there you go. What lessons could be drawn from it? Good question. Maybe you shouldn't decide to have referendums when you're in the waiting room at Manchester Airport is one lesson that could be drawn. But also more, shall we say, a slightly more sophisticated level. I think, you know, when it comes to referenda, as opposed to the consequences of the referendum itself, people, you know, who have it in their gift to call referendums should think very, very carefully about the terms of the referendum, the potential consequences of the referendum for society as a whole, and not simply for their particular faction of the political party that happens to be governing at the time. Yeah, so that's how I can best answer that question. Yeah.
So yes. Before I just one sentence to follow up to Carl Cordell. Yes, referendum can work in a local setting, as Switzerland shows, but usually it reduces complex problems to very simple dichotomy. But most importantly, is it conflict-ridden, and it kills enlightened deliberation, because the winners will wins on. This is not democracy when the winners wins on. So there's nothing for the loser, so to speak. It is yes or not, and democracy for me is an art of negotiations, bargaining, and deliberation. which the logic of referendum is totally opposite. So much about this, and the Brexit referendum is only one of many examples of basically inadequate means applied to complicated problems. But common questions of Professor Kaczmarczyk, I fully agree with what he said. You gave, what you said about the Ukrainian refugees in Poland is a very good example. But there are, of course, many others. It is not just that NGOs play a crucial role in Poland with migrants, but states are deciding about those things. Each time, the states decide about migrants only, in terms of legal positions, they decide. But where those migrants in the end up? Then end up in the suburbs of large cities. And usually these are the cities without resources, without lawmaking power, who are ending up with handling the issue. First, to find them shelter and food, then to find them possibly work, and then also to work out the relationship between local and migrant communities. So, you see, and this is a very good, but I look at cities more carefully than other networks. And this is a very good example. You see, today, if you ask yourself when to send your mother to a hospital, when you send your child to school, how to get to the job, are you talking about the state or the city? And majority of people live in the cities. But where are cities on the decision-making map? In Europe, there was so-called Pact of Amsterdam, which declared, yes, the European Union welcomes contributions of cities to the European integration. But give me a break, what does it mean welcome your contribution? This is like Juncker once said, I invite citizens of Europe to make contributions to European democracy. Oh, come on, citizens are supposed to be sovereign here. I'm sorry, this is what democracy is about. The same, the cities, the states are to decide everything for good or bad, and the cities are asked to wash dishes, yeah? And they are not even getting any resources. But the same counts for NGOs, you see. If you think about development aid, who is running development aid? The things which Carl Cordell said is the most important aspect, to make sure that migration is not being artificially generated because of corruptions, impoverishment, and climate change. Why? Now, these are usually NGOs. And who is saving life of those on the sea and trying to protect them from traffickers? These are again NGOs. We are treated as criminals by states. You see, and look, here we have to be, of course, careful. It is not like this that all cities are so great and all NGOs are great and all states are bad. I mean, I'm looking at, at those things as an analytical category. States can do some things better than cities. Cities can do some other things better, and NGOs are more suited for other things. And it is not like this, like my late friend Benjamin Barber argued, if the mayors would run the world, everything will be fine. No, I know a lot of mayors who I wouldn't like to have as prime ministers, yeah, and I'm not looking at Carl at the moment, but there are good cities, well managed and democratic, and there are failed cities, like there are workable states and failed states, networks are also, criminal organizations are also networks, yeah. So the point is here, in analytical terms, is not to say let's replace states by networks, or let these mayors run the world. I think the answer is here is that when the discrepancy between what you actually can contribute to good and legitimate governance and what you actually do contribute is becoming unsustainable, you have to make adjustments. And what I try to say is that, states still monopolize decision-making, which they call legitimate democratic decision-making, and the resources, and everybody has to play according to what they say. And I think this is unsustainable. And I even say that those who are not so touchy about their sovereignty, but are able to work with networks. I'm Dutch citizen, so I can give you a Dutch example. Take the Randstad. The Randstad is the area between Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Utrecht, which is not even a legal entity. There's not even formal statistics on Randstad. But we know that Randstad is the engine of growth and innovation in Holland. And basically no prime minister is even thinking about taking decisions on whatever without dealing with this informal network of Randstad. And you can, rural area is another example of this, and in Germany. So what I say that those states which actually are able to work with those other actors, either local or transnational, because these are not just local, some are transnational, they are doing much better. And the point here is that we should abolish the fiction that only state is effective and legitimate, and we should allow those other actors make their contributions. Sometimes it will be transnational or global, sometimes it would be, a local. I'm very pragmatic on this, you see, but pragmatic in terms not just of effectiveness, but also legitimacy, because to create this complex system and to make it at the same time transparent and accountable will not be easy. Because the one thing is to say that parliamentary representation doesn't work in nation states. Another is to envisage kind of alternative. And, for instance, in Europe, I was arguing a few years ago that we should create a second chamber to start with exactly in European Parliament, with representative of regions, cities, NGOs. This would be a first step to break monopoly of states in the European Union, because this monopoly is basically responsible for European paralysis, because they are unable to sort out any problems in the current system, but they are not going to delegate powers to the EU, central institutions, because this would mean suicide of states who are gatekeeper in the European Union. They're not going to commit suicide. So since I don't believe that they will ever create federations, because this would mean that they will give up powers, become local government in Europe, and the current systems of nation states control decision is totally unworkable. You know that yesterday even these decisions about the candidate status of Ukraine didn't go easily. Yeah? So I say if you cannot go up, you cannot go down, go way sideways. But this is technical discussion, you can say. But the logic here is very important, because you need to have alternative in order to delegitimize this pompous sovereignist, in some cases, semi-imperialist rhetoric, which is back in vogue. And I find it just totally at odds with reality. Sorry for being so long.
You may just have additional comments just to make the picture even more complex, because there's an ongoing discussion on the role of transnational companies in the immigration policies making, with all pros and cons of the story. So I fully agree. So this is becoming more and more complex, really.
See, I prefer those companies, for instance, in the European setting, which I know EU is my prime field. I prefer that they argue the case in the second chamber of parliament than in secret lobbying in Brussels. And frankly, some of those lobbyists are my good friends. They are not cheap. This is a good business, eh? They are not
so
poor.
this
is
is
a good
extremely
business.
powerful. Yeah, so this is what I'm saying. Yeah,
but not very transparent. Eh?
yeah, obviously, yeah.
Thank you. This discussion would go for long, but we have only 20 minutes left. So we have two other questions on the chat. So I will just propose both the questions at the same time, and then let's say 10 minutes for replying the questions, and we will conclude with the final conclusions of Dr. Sara Bojarczuk. So let me just read both the questions. The first one is, what kind of integration policies could be implemented in the EU states? So it's specific, particular that regards integration policies. And the second question is, don't you think that the persistence of dictatorial regimes and horrific violations of human rights in the countries of the Middle East and Africa are the largest part of Europe's challenges in the issue of migration? Therefore, to address mass migration, major changes must be made in parts of the world towards improving human rights situation that will alleviate the challenges. So these are the two final questions. Okay, let's say I leave you the decision to answer as you prefer, professors.
Well, I'll go first to give my colleague a bit of a break. What kind of integration policies? For hell, how long is a piece of string? I guess they revolve around education as much as anything else, particularly civic education, which results, or at least hypothetically would result in people being afforded a kind of common set of values around which people could agree as being of some kind of value, some kind of worth, although that is just much more easily said than it is done. Also, what I think is really important is perhaps the best way to integrate people is to actually not only educate them, but to ensure that they are economically stable. In other words, employment which actually provides a reasonable kind of income, and the twin benefits of what you might call full employment plus a decent educational system themselves would reduce areas of potential conflict between individuals and between groups. Persistence of dictatorial regimes, is it a challenge for Europe? Well, yeah, it is a challenge for Europe. It's most of all a challenge for the people who labor under their rule. It's a tricky one. Part of me says yes, of course. Europe needs to do something that reduces the scope for dictatorial regimes to flourish, but how that's actually achieved is a much more tricky question. There are various tools in the hypothetical toolbox that could be used. Engagement with NGOs, aid programs that promotes economic growth, mitigate the processes of climate change, but also a challenge, to use a horribly cliche word these days, to challenge the sort of, shall we say, the philosophical and moral foundations upon which certain states exist. Europe itself is not actually free from totalitarianism, as we've seen all too recently. Totalitarianism and authoritarianism in its various guises have long been inherent to European political cultures. So I think we need to beware sometimes of inadvertently essentializing other cultures as being, shall we say, irredeemably dictatorial, irredeemably intolerant, so on and so forth. There are sections within any society that are opposed to change, that seek to profit from inequality, that seek to profit from the misery of wider sections of society. Like I say, actually meeting these challenges and dealing with these challenges at a diplomatic level is incredibly difficult, it's incredibly intricate, but that is no reason not to try. And moreover, when, shall we say, a authoritarian regime wraps itself in the to mix metaphors, the flags of religion, the flags of culture, the flags of tradition, these, shall we say, historical stereotypes need to be confronted by various actors within global society, for want of a better expression, whether they be nation states, whether they be the sort of networks that Professor Zielonko has referred to, whether they be NGOs, whether they be individuals. And it's only then that you can perhaps deal with these root causes of migration, basically. If people have got little hope, but enough money to club together to send a relative elsewhere in the hope that that relative can establish roots and then maybe through family reunification programs start a channel of migration, you can't really blame people for that. But how you, like I say, how you combat that phenomenon, that desire, if you like, is not by appeasing people like Erdogan, Gaddafi, or the Sisi in Egypt, and large numbers of strong men and women whose names I can't currently remember. You do it by actually, in effect, trying to delegitimize their rule and undermine them, whilst at the same time making it, shall we say, bind them in some kind of hypothetical web from which they cannot escape, much, to end with a slight digression, much in the same way that Putin's tactics vis-a-vis the West are now becoming crystal clear. 20 years of engagement, appealing to short-termism and sheer greed until he was ready to pull the trigger. Which is not to say member states of the European Union should mimic Putin, but they should also learn how to play a long game. Okay.
Professor Zielonka? We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I agree with the last comments that politics should play long game, but I just finished a book arguing that basically the opposite happens. You see, and part of the story is the nature of democracy. Partly because, as we were talking, the democracy which is located in nation states is spatially selfish. Democracy is supposed to speak on behalf and for the benefit of its own citizens. So even the European Union, we see things are not resolved because states defend what they call national interest, but what they mean is we have to defend our people first. And second, democracy is also meiotic in temporal terms, because it gives priority to current voters and not to the future ones, or not to migrants who have no vote. But in particular in the future, why we don't solve problems of climate change? Because it affects largely those who do not have a vote today, and those who have a vote do not want to pay a price of addressing problems of the future. So the problem is not only this or that leader or this and that government, although I don't want to sound too symmetrist here. The problem is in the way in which our policies work. Now, to the question, I have only one comment. Look, horrible things happened in various parts of the world, and including also most developed part of the world. There was a kind of mythology when I was young that the horrible things happen only in the Middle East and Africa, and Europeans and Americans are free from all that. But we know now that this is not true. And frankly, how could this be true? Given that it was in Europe where gas chambers were basically employed for genocide. If you know what I mean, this was always rather dubious stereotype. But the question here is, I don't believe that there is one or two especially quick solutions to solve those issues. And some of those issues, as I said, like migration, are as old as humanity. I mean, if there would be one or two solutions, if you read newspaper and the ad tells you how to become a millionaire in 3 months, or how to lose 5 kilos in 2 weeks. Do you believe in this? But journalists and politicians constantly try to offer us those simple solutions to solving this tremendous problems of humanity in a simple way. I don't want to say the simple solutions are totally useless, because I believe in try and error policies. Exactly, instead of forging any utopian visions and to force anybody to implement them. But we have to understand that the simple solutions can solve part of the problems and not only not the broader ones. Take inherited tax. It cannot eliminate inequality. It can contribute to inequality, but there would always, with all these solutions, be also winners and losers, and we have to balance those things. And therefore, here, democracy is very important. That these decisions are not privileging one group of people over the other. The problem which has happened, in recent years, and which is, I suppose, and here I finish, a major reasons for illiberal surge in recent years, and I here can do small promotions. My last book was about this. It's Counter-Revolution. It was also in Polish. Was that we kind of, liberals like myself, my generations, in order to sort out these problems, we delegated more and more powers to bodies which are not elected, central banks, constitutional courts, European Commission, sometimes for very good reasons. Why we allow central banks are supposed to control our finances, so the government of the day doesn't spend money which they don't have, and punishing the future generation, for instance, right? The same about constitutional courts. Why we give powers to constitutional courts? Because we don't want majority of the day to take away rights of minorities, for instance, including migrants. And why we give powers to European Commission? Because the states cannot reach agreement on most of the things. So you need to have a body which actually does something. The problem is that increasingly we create a situation in which elections become meaningless, that the elections could change the government, but couldn't change policies really. And so people felt that they have a vote, but no voice. And this becomes unsustainable. And this, in my view, this is a major explanation of the rise of illiberal sovereignist politicians. Because I actually don't think those people are so exciting, so visionary and charismatic. I'm not very impressed by this. But they are so strong because so to speak, we are so weak, and it certainly applies to countries featuring in this debate, Poland, Britain, or Italy. I mean, there is a problem here with the kind of people who would like to see more progressive liberal politics. We are not very strong at present, partly because of the legacy, partly because we lack what was supposed to be our major strengths, intellectual strength, to propose alternatives to what is not working. And if you look at parties today, you know, who try to convince people to get rid of illiberal politicians, they rather discuss party coalitions or some electoral tricks rather than create the visions which would make people believe that they really count, and that we can regain the future, you see, or reclaim the future. And this is, in my view, the major task now: how to reclaim the lost future. If you want to know detailed comments on this, I invite you to look at my new books, which will come in a few months. Thank you. Exactly on this title. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Professor Cordell, Professor Zielonka, for this very interesting, vivid debate, for sharing your points and for your talks. Thank you everybody for participating. And at the moment, I leave the floor to Dr. Sara Bojarczuk, head of the Social Cultural Research Unit of the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw, for final conclusions.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be relatively concise, to fit 10 minutes into, let's say, less than 5. The discussion that we've had today was very interesting, and indeed it raised a number of questions that are very relevant, especially in light of what's happening in Europe at the moment. So to come back to the general question that we started our seminar with, what is the future of Europe and migration? And judging by our discussion, the future of Europe and migration is quite precisely future of nation state and democracy, in particular how sovereignty plays a role and how national states will redefine its role and its characteristics through the challenges that it faces. But the key question that is highlighted throughout our discussion is that, did the nation state fail us, or is it just evolving and its nature is changing? And in particular, the question is important in light of recent events such as pandemic and where the nation state took us, and what was the role of other actors during the pandemic. How nation state supports its citizens, its people, throughout the various political and economic challenges, such as current issue of stagflation or threat of cybersecurity, and changing climate and the challenges it's posed for ordinary people. And they are the ones who actually take the toll of what is happening at the moment. So in particular, nation state should or is redefined through the challenges that we're facing. The migration and the current forced migration from Ukraine is the very challenging, very important issue to address, because as we said, as we all throughout different events, we speculate to happen with people from Ukraine. And indeed, some of them are going to stay in Europe in different countries. Some of them are going to come back. Some of them will keep going elsewhere. But what are we going to do with them? How are we going to accommodate for them, both in terms of simple humanitarian help, but also into integration into different societies. And that includes all education as well as employment and providing them decent standard of living. Nonetheless, migration is a highly politicized issue. We can see that open borders or open internal borders enforcing external borders, we witness also a shift in paradigm, but where does that exactly take us? Does it take us to focusing on securing our external borders? And we could see that, we can see the consequences of that through Brexit, through recent issues with Rwanda's refugees, with the case of Belarusian border in Poland. We can see that, and the Ukrainian as well. So overly focusing on the securing external border, does it improve the functioning of what's inside the European community? Additionally, the case that we should address is the matter of structural inequalities within a society. And on the one hand side, the arguments that had been brought up here today is that we increasingly give migrants more rights or equal rights as the native citizens, but do they really have equal rights? And finally, Professor Zielonka called on unbounding that is taking place, and in particular, the increased role of social networks and other actors such as civil societies, NGOs, or transnational companies, as it rose during the discussion. And so I would call on for a clear cooperation between those agents, as we cannot avoid having them all as a part of politics and creating politics. It's as also our speakers explained, is that this open collaboration is the key for success, and it's not necessarily the secret lobbying as we've met, as you've talked about. It's the open, clear collaboration and mutual respect. So to conclude and leave our seminar with a message that Professor Cordell called on as a lesson from Brexit, I think we should take into account who is a winner and who is a loser, and assess carefully for the consequences to satisfy not only political elites, but most importantly, people who are at the recipient end of the whole process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for this concluding remarks. So I have the pleasure to close officially our seminar and especially express my gratitude to my colleague from Center of Migration Research, Kamila Kowalska, that was the main coordinator of the event, and also she was responsible for all the details regarding the speeches, the scope of the event, and so on. So I'm very happy that she decided to contribute to the Center of Migration Research activities through this webinar. Also, my thanks goes to two keynote speakers. So Karl and Jan, we know that you are busy. You know that you are also very often traveling for different academic and research purposes. So we are very happy that still we were able to find together a day during almost summer holidays to discuss what's going on in Europe, in the EU member states, but also in our close neighborhood. Because as we've seen from this discussion, migration is only one component of this bigger picture that we see now. So it's not only about how to manage migration, how to design and implement EU migration policy or EU policy in the field of international migration, international protection. It's everything interconnected with the external developments in our neighborhood. So now mostly in eastern part of Europe. But also we should not forget about the developments in broadly understood Mediterranean region, what was raised by our colleagues Willem Barda in one of his questions. So once again, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, for asking smart questions and trying to address these questions, and also to look for possible steps to be taken. So this was our last open CMR webinar before summer holidays, and we hope that we will get back to these online events just after holidays. And we know all that there will be many topics to be covered, because the crisis, or the, let's say, humanitarian situation is still very complex in terms of post-Ukrainian post-migration management. Also, the political instability due to foreign policy by Russia is increasing. So there will be more than less to discuss. So once again, thank you all. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Pavel, for being with us, and Dominika for your very precise comments after the speeches. So thank you very much. The video from the meeting is already available on the website of CMR on Facebook, and then it will be also prepared to be posted on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much, and see you guys during future events. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.